Hey guys, welcome back to Mental Game in Action and Happy New Year. Today we're going to be jumping into the mental game leaks that pop up post-hand. How we evaluate and learn from the hands that we play is a huge part of maximizing our potential, and yet this is still an area where many of the mental game leaks that we have show up. I'm going to be using examples from my recent trip to Vegas to play the WPT Main Event to illustrate this. Without further ado, let's dive right in.
I don't want you to quit.
I don't mind. Shut out this equity for Dwan, not necessarily the sizing that Dwan likes to.
Dude, what are you doing?
All right, I'm out of here. I'm too steamed up this month.
All right, the first hand we're going to talk about is a hand involving a European reg who sat at my table and a older recreational. So the European opens from the low jack. He gets 3-bet by the button. Button is the recreational. Folds around, European reg calls. We then get the flop. The flop is ace 10 6. European reg checks. The recreational bets small, maybe 25%. The reg re-raises and then gets 3-bet by the reg. European reg tanks for some time and decides to call. The turn comes a 3 and it now goes check, check. The river is a jack. The European reg leads for maybe half pot and then gets jammed on for maybe 3 times his bet, but putting him all in. We now get infinite tank from the European reg. He eventually gets time called on him and his hand is killed by the time. As soon as this happens, the recreational with pride turns over pocket 5s. Now, this is a crazy hand. The C5-5 is super surprising. I discussed this hand with multiple people, some of them being the regs at my table and some other players that I know. And what I noticed is players kind of fell into 2 camps. The first camp was, this is an incredibly hard to predict line. What our opponent has is very difficult to predict, and seeing 5-5 is incredibly surprising. The other camp was, is 5-5 a good bet in theory? And suddenly they're debating whether or not 5-5 is a profitable bluff. Now, the value in reviewing any hand is how can I improve my ability to predict the way my opponents play so I can play better against them, certainly in wild spots like this. And these 2 approaches I detailed are actually 2 attempts to do the same thing, just from very different sources. One is from a more human element of just, how do we predict how a human being will show up here with 5-5? And one is through a theoretical element of, if I can see the theoretical reasons why 5-5 makes sense here, maybe then I can predict it in the future. The problem is with the second, you're thinking about this hand through a framework that doesn't map onto the opponents you're playing against. Even if this hand is a great bluff in theory, and even if you can consider this as a theoretical bluff in the shoes of the person who might be calling, that doesn't improve your ability to actually play this spot better at all. And there can be something comforting in saying, well, that person is kind of a mystery, but solvers are within reach. So let's talk about that. But that doesn't actually improve your ability to play this spot better. When you see hands like this, the relevant data should be, is there any way for me to have predicted that this person might be running an insane bluff here? And I'm going to inject a piece of knowledge. One thing that this recreational continually did in the hands leading up to this is complain about how he's getting no hands and how he has played no pots. Now, I'm not saying you can draw a straight line from that to this, but there's no way the building frustration that was being observed in him leading up to this hand had nothing to do with the way he played this hand. Is it completely predictable? Could I have seen that and said, well, this is probably a bluff? I don't know, but noticing that is far more useful to me than noticing the theoretical elements in play of why this hand might be a good bluff. And I saw so many regs spend so much time talking about how 5-5 doesn't interact with folds and all of these concepts that are completely useless. The only thing that matters is, can I predict how this player will show up in this spot with this hand in the future? Okay, for the second hand, I want to talk more about how it is we review our own hands when we play spots where things don't go quite correctly or we're not sure if we played the hand right. So there's 2 kinds of spots. There's one where you played a spot that you think is very standard and your best approach to it was something theoretical. Now, if you believed the spot was going to play in a theoretical manner and you did your best approximation of theory and then responded in that way, going to a solver and looking at the outputs from it, seeing how your expectations around solver play mesh with that output is useful. You're going to learn something there because it tracks with the headspace you were in. Now, there's tons of spots, though, where that's not what we're doing, where we get in a kind of branch of the tree where we have a specific expectation around the kinds of hands we're going to see there, and then we make a play given those expectations. This brings me to the hand that I played. I'll run through it quickly. I wanted to show you in my hand history, but it doesn't look like the hand was captured, so I'm just going to talk you through it. We're maybe 28 big blinds deep, cutoff opens, folds around me to the big blind. I have king, queen off, and I call. Flop comes down something like 9-7-4 of spades, and I have the king of spades. I check, I get quarter pot bet into, I quarter pot raise, then I get clicked back again. Now, my expectation here was that this should basically never be the nut flush from my opponent, and I viewed my king as essentially the nut flush blocker, and I jammed, thinking at best that I might get a fold from a hand that is now in over their head and not wanting to play this spot. And at worst, I might be in against another flush, but I have the nut flush draw as a backup. Now, what happened was I got snap called by ace queen of spades. And basically, let's turn to the solver, and I want to show you how many people will respond in this spot. So they'll get into this spot, they'll see a check, their opponent maybe bets. This is actually not the size that we expect to see here, but it's the one that I node locked in GTO Wizard. So just because that's what we saw. So we get this quarter pot bet, and then they'll look at their raise, and okay, so let's say I shouldn't be raising this hand, that it's too good, but maybe they look at king jack, king 10, all these other offsuit combos, and they think, okay, it can't be that bad. Then we see the click back, and we see if we were to just look at spade hands, include spade hands, we see they're overwhelmingly calling, especially ace-x, and that many of the ones that are in fact putting it in are lower spades. So yeah, so we, our assumptions was basically right in theory. And so they'll look at this and say, like, yeah, ace queen should never be clicking back. Like, maybe I didn't choose the best king hand, but king high spade seems to be doing a decent job. And then they might go to the jam spot here and say the same thing, like, okay, maybe our best king X are not the best choices for jams, but there are lots of king X hands here doing it, mostly king X with straight draws. So maybe I need to improve my equity a little, and maybe, but my opponent made a big mistake by clicking back with ace queen. And that's kind of where they might end their study. They might just say, my opponent made mistakes, I made some mistakes, here's how I can prove my mistakes, but my opponent's hand was certainly egregious, or something like that. And this is where mental game shows up in the way we review hands. If we are pursuing some specific certainty around how do I play better and how do my opponents make mistakes, it can lead us into getting emotionally comforted by knowledge of our opponents making mistakes and how we can improve. That doesn't actually map on to what happened. What happened was not a theoretical assumption about how my opponent will be playing. It was a real world assumption about what I would think they would do with real hands. And that changes what is profitable with my real hands. And seeing that my opponent had ace queen, there's a different question here of what is the mental state of somebody who clicks back in a spot like this. Now, it might be a one-off and it might not be something that's super common, but by turning my mind towards the things that actually drove the decisions, I start gaining this skill of being able to predict better and better my opponent's strategies. You might get better and better at producing theory by doing the first thing, but that won't change the fact that in this spot, I wasn't trying to play theory. So in that spot, it doesn't help me at all. The only thing that's going to improve me is getting closer and closer to the mental state and understanding how those mental states produce actions in my opponents. And for me, the clickback looked like an uncomfortable thing that someone would be doing with a hand that they thought was vulnerable and didn't want to face more action. That requires self-awareness in the moment to say that that's what I thought that this 3-bet clickback represented. When in reality, it clearly was just greed from the nut flush that didn't want to call and wasn't willing to just see if more money goes in on future streets. These are two totally different mental states people are in when clicking back. And I made a very specific read about what a clickback meant, and I was just wrong. Improving that is going to get us closer and closer and closer to making better plays, certainly in abstract and random parts of the game tree. Theory is not going to help you there. And now you can go to theory to lock in assumptions about how people play to see the best possible exploits. It's possible that even given my assumptions that my hand was poor, and that the way I played given the assumptions was bad. And it seems to be the case. When I look at the solver and I look at how my opponent is playing the clickback grind, my assumptions were far closer to theory, and yet my hand isn't doing what I thought it would do. So there's something happening even in my exploitative way of thinking. All of these are far better things to be considering when you get to a hand and the hand goes in a way you didn't expect it to go. And your things not going the way you expect it to go is the source of how you're going to improve at this game. Not a super long video today, but to sum up, if you make a decision based on a specific prediction of how your opponent's going to play, you need to go to the source of where that prediction came from. Basically, inside of you, what are the things that caused you to predict that? And can you improve that? Many times this won't have anything to do with a solver. And if you're going to a solver to review these spots, you're often missing the exact area of skill development that is going to make you a better player. Focus on where these decisions came from. And if where that decision came from was a theory-based consideration of how to play, awesome. But if you find yourself always considering how to play theory and therefore always going to solvers to make sure you're playing theory correctly, my assessment of this would be you're probably doing this out of comfort and out of avoiding the gray area that comes in trying to assume how people are actually playing. And therefore, you're also avoiding a very important part of skill development in poker. The more you can understand how people are viewing spots and the more you can understand how you are viewing how people view spots, the more dangerous a poker player you can become. I hope this was useful for you, and I can't wait to see